So for me, the psychological IFS definition that I have for addiction is that it's a chronic polarization. It's a polarization between the team of parts that's trying to keep the person together and functioning, but also at the same time, severely self-loathing and contemptuous. We call them managers. The parts that are trying to control the system sort of through negative control and are trying to help them hang on, in opposition to the category of parts in the system that's trying to soothe, escape, avoid, and medicate. And both are sort of in this polarization, trying to prevent the client from being flooded with emotional pain. So for me, that key is that polarization, because we're not just treating the parts, and Jan would agree, of course, we're not just treating the parts that are using. I say we're not treating a symptom, we're treating a system. And so we have to also treat that negative self-hatred, that negative view, and underlying trauma, all of it together. So all those parts can contribute to us helping clients get out.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the show. I'm joined here with Jan Winhall and Cece Sykes. So Jan is one of the world's leading experts on how polyvagal theory can be applied to treat addiction. And Cece is probably one of the world's leading experts on how internal family systems can be applied to treat and heal addiction. So I thought it'd be really interesting to bring them both together here for a discussion on how these two might actually complement each other to really, provide a deep and lasting solution for anybody that's working in or working as a mental health professional. So to get started, I think it might be interesting to get us all on the same page. If both of you guys were to give your definitions and understanding of addiction. And Cece, I'm aware that you don't actually like the word addiction. You prefer the word addictive process. So can you maybe tell us about your thinking behind this and your definition, and then we'll move over to Jan after that.
Sure. Well, and of course, like everyone, we need to use the word addiction so we all know what we're talking about. And there's a certain sort of, maybe just say, seriousness with the word addiction that I think is important. But at the same time, and I know Jan will be able to talk about this as well, I'm so frustrated with definitions about brain disease and even medical disease as being very limiting as to what a psychotherapist can do sitting in a room across from someone who's suffering. So for me, it's a process. It's developmental. Things started when kids were young. There's some trauma, attachment wounds, alienation when kids were young. It developed over time, and the healing takes time. So it's all an addictive process. So for me, the psychological IFS definition that I have for addiction is that it's a chronic polarization. It's a polarization between the team of parts that's trying to keep the person together and functioning, but also at the same time, severely self-loathing and contemptuous. We call them managers. The parts that are trying to control the system sort of through negative control and are trying to help them hang on, in opposition to the category of parts in the system that's trying to soothe, escape, avoid, and medicate. And both are sort of in this polarization, trying to prevent the client from being flooded with emotional pain. So for me, that key is that polarization, because we're not just treating the parts, and Jan would agree, of course, we're not just treating the parts that are using. I say we're not treating a symptom, we're treating a system. And so we have to also treat that negative self-hatred, that negative view, and underlying trauma, all of it together. So all those parts contributed to us getting here, and all those parts can contribute to us helping clients get out.
Okay, so just to clarify here, so we're almost saying that there's this underlying pain or trauma, like this emotional wound that's there, and people in response to that develop these two different aspects. People with addictive process develop these two different aspects. One side is what you might call firefighters, that are basically, they soothe, they sort of help to distract through these maybe addictive behaviors. And then the other side of that are these managers or these protector parts that are really sort of controlling, self-critical, inner critics, and all the rest. And this dynamic, this polarization between these two elements is what helps to keep the focus off the pain of the exiles. And this creates this sort of internal system or dynamic.
Right. And it keeps people busy up here in a polarity about use, don't use, function, get out of control, and adds to their inability to connect to what's vulnerable inside and address what's really an underlying need.
That's fascinating. Okay, Jan, let's hear your perspective on this.
Well, this is so interesting because it fits in so beautifully. And I think this is why, Cece, we've really resonated with each other, and we're really enjoying getting to know how each other works, because there is this way in which we also recognize this polarization, but in more of a kind of neurophysiological way through the polyvagal lens. But it feeds into this same kind of paradigm shift that we're both talking about. So through a polyvagal lens, we would see that addictive behaviors are ways that the body is instinctively coping and struggling to survive because of being caught in these trauma feedback loops of, feeling this tremendous anxiety in this sympathetic flight fight state where, where the body is searching for ways to numb and to shut down into the more dorsal branch of that vagus nerve, which brings relief and dissociation. And so we would say that addictive behaviors help us to shift back and forth between those two very basic neurophysiological states in the body, in the autonomic nervous system. And I always talk about this, exactly what you're talking about, but I love the language of polarization, and to say that I think the reason that a lot of trauma therapists don't want to work with addiction is because they got caught in the polarization too. And then they become part of that, the managers. And right? And then it's a terrible situation, because then you're caught in the same dynamic that your client's caught in, that you're speaking about, in terms of, it's all up here. And it's not just up here. It's something that is happening. And I think when we add the nervous system dimension to IFS, it's like a little turbo engine. It just really helps to understand how that polarization is like a story, in a sense, that we tell ourselves and get caught up in. But in actual fact, it's a very powerful physiological response in the body, because the body can't stay in those dysregulated states, those trauma feedback loops of flight, fight, freeze, and then shut down. You can't survive there. You have to shift from one state to the other, back and forth, in order to, yeah. So you and I think, are really working on how we can really integrate this model and really help therapists to move out of pathologizing and out of polarization.
Right. And out of sort of unconsciously aligning with the controlling side of the controlling and fear-based side, like, oh my God, they relapsed.
Yeah, and then if you relapse, you got to go back to step one, honey.
Yeah, that's right. Lose all your chips.
I mean, this is terrible when you think about it in terms of the struggle and the power dynamic, right? And how it's I don't think it's meant to be punishing.
No, of course not.
But it is. It is experienced as a severe loss, right? A loss of the success that you've had, which doesn't make any sense physiologically either, because neural pathways are there.
Right, Jan. And I think that another paradigm shift, and I love that you introduced that phrase into what we're doing here, is also not focusing on what's not working right, but what is working right. So rather than look at I relapsed, we, of course, relapse, I say relearn, what else, what are we missing? What can we go back and find that we didn't catch the first time? But, and let's just also notice that you've spent this many months, this many years, this many days not using. And so it's that focus on what's wrong rather than what's going well that also, I think, is an unbalanced way to look at. We don't do that with depression and anxiety. When someone's depressed and they're getting better and then they sort of sink, we don't say, oh my God, back to square one. You better find a new therapist. You're at square one. This isn't working. You're not working. You're not working hard enough. Why didn't you call your sponsor? I mean, again, not calling your sponsor. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't want to put that down. That can be supportive, but it's the idea. It's the idea that it's fear-based.
Yeah, and it doesn't make sense physiologically, because we understand feedback loops and neuroplasticity. We know that if you've had a year of moving away from addictive behaviors, that year is represented in the brain through this pathway that's developed, a new pathway. You don't lose that because you have a drink. So it's not even physiologically accurate. The other thing, of course, through the polyvagal lens is we always go back to safety. So if a person relapses, we say, okay, let's look at what's happening in your body. Let's look what's happening in your nervous system. Something must have happened where through neuroception, right, the body's process of detecting safety and danger, your body detected danger. And so it went back into a trauma feedback loop using addictions as a way of helping you to survive. And so then we can start to trace, well, what was going on? Is an anniversary coming up, or did you something happened where you got triggered, and then you kind of dissociated the trigger, and then you went out and you got drunk, and now you're not sure how that all happened. But when we pause and go into the body through the nervous system and through felt sensing, so connecting deeper into your experiencing through the body, then we can start to understand why your body went back to the trauma system of, using behaviors that hurt you in the short term, or in the long term, but they help you in the short term.
Jan, I'm kind of curious to follow up here, just for anybody that's maybe coming across this idea for the first time. But a lot of your work centers around polyvagal or addictions as being a state regulation strategy of the nervous system. Could you maybe unpack this for us a little bit more and explain what we're getting at here?
Yeah. So the way we understand addictions is through how they function. And I think in some ways this relates to IFS. We may use different language and we talk about parts as opposed to neurophysiological states, but they relate to each other too, right? So we understand addictions as ways that people instinctively know in their body to manage dysregulated states of either too much flight fight, too much of that sympathetic state, like firefighters, right? Or too much of a shutting down and numbing and dissociating and hiding really from the world. And in either of those states, we can't survive if we stay there for too long. They're metabolically too challenging. They're too threatening for the body. And so instinctively, the body will look for ways to be able to shift back and forth. So for example, a simple way would be through, say, drinking. So if you come home from work and you feel really anxious, right? Like you had a fight with your boss, you're afraid you're going to get fired or whatever, and you drink a bottle of wine, you may feel stimulated for a while, but then you're going to shift into dorsal and you're going to get relief. You're going to get dissociation and numbing, shutting down of the system and relief. And it's the only relief that is available to you because your body isn't detecting enough safety to shift into a more grounded ventral state and say, call my friend Cece and say, I just had a really nasty day. Do you have time for a coffee? We don't do that when we don't feel safe. We go inside and we find those ways of being able to manage very effectively to shut us down, right? Or it can also go the other way. Say, for example, cutting the body. So if you're feeling really in a very dissociated, numb state, and you cut the body, the sight of blood for some people will activate the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. They go up into flight fight, up into the firefighters, up into that awakened place. I think that is Cece. And then you're shifting out of dorsal, which again, you can't stay in forever. You would die. I mean, that's literally, I've checked this out with Steve. So I feel very grounded in what I'm saying here about the neurophysiology. So that's how we understand it in that very embodied way.
Very interesting. Okay. Cece, can we jump over to you here? And I wanted to ask, what makes IFS such an effective treatment for addictive processes? Like why have you decided to make this the central focus of your treatment with clients that are struggling with addiction?
Well, I think the why is more personal, which is just growing up in an Irish Catholic family, and pretty much as we say, if I do my genogram, I can cover all what we call firefighters or acting out. Perhaps you have some relationship to that, Niall. I don't know. You don't have to speak to that. Drinking, drugs, gambling, also sexual inappropriateness, some incest, all of the things, some more serious than others, but a wide range and a lot of suffering. So there is the affectionate way of looking at it, but there's also the way in which there's been enormous suffering, multi-generational suffering. So suicide and so forth. So, and loss, so, when I first heard the model described, which I won't get into the whole thing now, but takes the whole array of the human personality and divides it into 3 big categories, because the developer, Dick Schwartz, is sort of a family systems guy. So he's kind of thinking, how do the systems work together? So when I first heard about that, I kind of wept. I thought, oh, it just made so much sense for the people I loved who are also harming themselves or others, or, so that went right into me. As they say, laser beam through baloney, right to my heart. That's a share line. Anyway, just to love share. Just to this place, though, of healing for me. Okay, that these firefighters had a positive intention underneath their negative behavior to manage pain and to get away from, unbearable suffering. So this has been my interest from, which was 25 years ago when I first, heard this discussed, in the late 90s. So I began thinking about this and thinking about how this works in the system, and began thinking, well, what is addiction then? If we look at this process and this feedback loop or recurring crisis-based, fear-based, pain-based cycle. And IFS managers, as we say, the parts that we want our neighbors and our co-workers to see. We're kind, we're useful, we're helpful, we're thoughtful. We take care of vulnerable people. But the other part of managers is improvement. And when that gets distorted, it becomes self-hatred, self-loathing. What's wrong with me? I do nothing wrong. That perfectionism, which is not being perfect, but it's saying no matter what I do, I could have done it better. So that sort of core base of sort of working will happen when you're trying so hard to function in a family where no one's helping you. So we would say one set of protectors is becoming highly managed. But another set of protectors, we can only manage so long before we start to feel shame again, or loneliness, or not appreciated. And so then we have this other set of parts that gives us some relief. And I'd really love to translate, Jan, we'll come back to this, where, the ventral, the sympathetic, and how we would apply that. But the firefighters being any kind of soothing, we all soothe, watch Netflix, eat chips, or you would say crisps, and, have a glass of wine. People do different things to, take a walk your dog, play with your dog, make a phone call to a dear friend. There's many ways in which we resource, but what we're resourcing, when we have so much desperation and neglect, we need far more soothing. So this idea of IFS helps us. The other aspect of IFS is that when we sort of unblend, if you will, or identify a part and get some space from it, what emerges is a sort of it's a ventral vagal window of tolerance, place of calm, of connection, where we have some creativity. Like, oh, I know what I could do. My clients come up with solutions for themselves that I would never think of, right, Jan? They think, they play the ukulele. So we call that self. This place of calm and ability to witness ourselves. And so a new neural pathway, when I can have empathy toward the part of me that drinks and drugs, and I can have empathy toward the part of me that's loathing and contemptuous and hostile. What's wrong with you? when I can listen to that, sort of unblend from that, and really understand the positive intention behind those negative activities, I would say that hating ourselves has to be treated as much as drinking. You can't escape it. Those two sides of us are hinged. They're hinged. When I drink less, I hate myself less. When I hate myself less, I need to soothe less, right? But what holds the hinge, what's the hinge of these two sides is all our vulnerability. You know, our old vulnerability that we grew up with, neglect, not being seen, not being valued, not feeling good enough. And then the new shame we add to it when we struggle and fail, if you will, at living the life we want to live. So I really like this model for getting into the nuances of our emotions and listening to them in a really powerful way. And the last thing I'll say, and then I want to turn it over, is we also use the body. We say, where do you find that part in and around your body? And that question emerged from a collaboration between Dick and Ron Kurtz, who was Hakomi, right? Who graduated to sensory motor with Pat Ogden and so on and so forth. So this idea of where, Dick would never have thought, he said, I would never have thought of that. He's the cerebral professor type. But how do you find that in your body? So when we're tracking, a trigger, we might just say, I had a heavy heart. Well, let's listen to the parts in your heart. Or I might have had an anxious belly, tight jaw, restless leg, headache, backache. So all of those things in IFS, in addition, we would say, so I might say to my client, if we call that part, where in your head, if you focus right there, and if we call that a part of you, let's listen to it. Does it have anything to say? So, we've learned also, as deeply, Jan, that the body has connecting through the body, which some people do quite naturally. It's almost the only way they connect. And other people are a little bit more, I need to name this part. It has to have a name. I have to get to know it that way. Is all powerful ways to get information and to create regulation. We create regulation by unblending. Listening to a part, hearing its intention, and connecting to it. It's by building relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be the same in terms of the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. So, and I think one of the things that can be so helpful, Cece, in using both of these models to really integrate is when we go into the body, then where does this part live in your body? And working with that through a deep kind of focusing practice of getting into all of the different aspects of what's happening in there in the experience. And then also helping people to recognize perhaps what nervous system state they're in that part, right? And I think that can really
That's
also
nice. I like to, I like this.
I think this is where we can really do some work and perhaps do a demo where we can really help people to see how we work and bring in both of these models with a person. So you can see where we might start off. You can start with a part first, and then you deepen it into the body, work with, what is happening in your nervous system in these parts that often I think with the, we can feel into that flight, fight energy. And when we can help people to really get into that, it also helps you to recognize what part you're in, right? So you can go into the body through it or into more of the personality part of it and work at both ends. Because as you say, people are different, and at different times you're going to be able to recognize something that starts with a body sensation or something that starts with a nasty thought. And then we can go both ways into that and just help people to deepen their experience more and more with this. For example, the critic part that you talk about, we would call that the critic. And working with what is that? How does your body carry that in terms of what nervous system state you're in? And what then do you need if you're stuck in this a really uncomfortable, constricted place in the body? And teaching people that, self in this ventral state, we could into that again through the language you're talking about of unblending. We would say that too, right? Because in order to really move beyond where we are, we have to be able to have our own experience, and then what's happening with different parts of us and what's happening in our body. That there is this self place that is always there somewhere.
That's right. Always there. In fact, at the top of my slide on self, Jan, always there somewhere, exactly. It feels like, when someone comes into us, people say to me, they're chaotic, they're, laughing, crying, telling stories, and they say, where is the self energy there? Or where is the regulation there? I don't, can this, people say, can this one regulate, or does this one really have a self? And you say, in moments, right? We build on those where they just have an awareness, they have a moment, they take that big breath and go, okay, I am so lonely. Oof.
Yes, I think this is so important, is to be careful to not to diminish. Like when we blend theories, when we integrate different models, we don't want to bring them in and then diminish them all. We want to bring them in and enhance them. So I think what we're saying too is that not to sort of make it too simple, that, in an IFS state, a firefighter is always in sympathetic, or a manager is always in whatever that, it's I think much more nuanced, and yet there is something about it that also is common and can really help people to feel into that, flared, like somebody I was working with the other day who talked about this really angry part as the Terminator.
Yes. Yes.
And to help that person, I said, like, what does Terminator feel like in your body? And it's constricted, and look at my face, right? And so then helping them to see, well, where does that live in your nervous system? Well, that's definitely fight.
Uh-huh.
And then helping them to see that fight is not self.
Uh-huh.
It's not ventral. Fight is a state of defense. Do you want to live like that permanently? No, it's not fun. And it's too taxing on the body. So I think in that way, we can bring these things together and then play with them a bit.
Right.
Sorry, just to sort of follow up on that then, Cece, you're sort of saying that whenever, let's say Jan was working with that client and they do identify this inner terminator, that's this, this constricted state, you would
Yeah.
then work with that person to relate to that part in a compassionate way, which might help it to relax and be more flexible in the overall system.
Right. I mean, I love Jan sort of getting a handle on it so that the client sort of knows that place in their body and it gets super familiar. Like they know this is anger, and they can identify it as it's maybe even escalating. And in IFS, I was just thinking that as we go, I'd say, so how do you feel toward your angry part? I need it, let's get to know it. And how is it trying to help you? And what's its intention? And as we focus, and something that we're both talking about, Jan, is focusing deeply and helping our clients focus deeply, sort of on one emotion or emotional state at a time. So if a critic comes in and says, I hate my anger, it's hurting people, you have to have that step back.
Yeah.
I always say, let the critic know it has an excellent point. This part is tough, but you see if it'll let you talk to it. It doesn't want to talk to the critic. And how's it trying to help? And what is it afraid will happen if you don't get angry, if it calms down? And so in IFS, what we then usually hear is something like, you'll be walked over, you'll be a doormat, you won't be seen, you won't be heard. You say, has that ever happened to you? Yeah. All right. So then in IFS, that would lead to what we would call the exiles or the vulnerability. And the person may very likely then tell the story of being in 5th grade and now their older brother or their thing at school or the thing before. So then you're going to seeing how, again, the systemic piece, which is this firefighter that's going to be angry, is going to come out when the voiceless 4-year-old or the shamed 5th grader feeling is in there. So then we would help the client work with that vulnerable part. All right, ask the anger if it'll give us some space to work with that 4-year-old. And again, it's a process, right? So maybe there's only a little bit our client can do in this moment with that part, but just recognize, wow, I had no idea how much that connects to my anger. That's a neural pathway, that awareness, these little neural pathways throughout our system is, I don't know how you would phrase this, Jen. You're using the neurology more directly than I am. But I always think of it as, when they talk about the brain disease, well, what about the rest of your brain? Yes, there's some neural pathways, as Patrick Carnes says, 6-lane highway to the brain, to the reward system. Yep, those ruts are in there. But when you listen to your anger with empathy, or when you're connecting to it differently, when you're connecting to your vulnerability in an old story, you're building those new neural pathways. And that's so hopeful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely. And all that you're saying, I started off, I think you did too, as a social worker trained in systems theory. And so all that you're saying is how I've worked for years. And so I relate to it very much. And I think what we can do then with that in terms of working with different parts is also add that piece of people understanding where that comes from in terms of this basic autonomic nervous system processing of neuroception and how we survive. And that then links us back to our commonality of depathologizing. It's like all of these things are ways that the bodies have of adapting. Because we're designed to survive at all costs.
That's right. That's right. It's such an important reframe. Someone who's been told so many times in treatment, and again, people have had beautiful experiences in treatment, but when it has not been beautiful, it's often been painful and reinforces really negative self-talk and
Shame stuff.
isolation.
Yeah. And when we've chatted before too, Cece, about how in the trauma world, the trauma world is one world, the addiction world has been another world. And I think you and I know, and lots of us doing this work on the ground, that these things are not separate. We had a wonderful conversation where we were just enjoying so much what we've been experiencing and not having a lot of people to talk about it with, that I'm so grateful for Niall for doing this series.
Yes.
Because this is the cutting edge, really. It really is. It's like you and I know trauma and addiction are married.
Of course they are.
And we talked about this. It's like if you're working with trauma, honey, you're working with addiction.
Yeah, and it can be attachment wounds. Some people don't identify as having complex childhood trauma. They didn't grow up abused exactly. If they might not identify that.
No.
They've had all these losses, right? Or they have had alienation. They've grown up, LGBTQ, identifying queer in a
absolutely, absolutely.
or neurodiverse in a world where there's no space for them. So and I know you know that too, but all of those things that they identify as all that pain and disconnection, and neglect, no one there to help with those early wounds. They say, if no one is protecting me, I'm going to protect myself.
Yeah. And I think also, Cece, I mean, the level of global trauma now is such that, and phones, addiction to phones and whatever, I think we're absolutely seeing and COVID, generations of young people that do not have a trauma history growing up. And they have a global trauma history of trying to survive in a world that is so dysregulated. And so we're really in trouble. And thank goodness that people like Niall are offering these spaces where you and I that have been doing this work for so long can really reach out and help younger therapists that are trying to find their way. And we've talked about this too. There's so many different models that you can use and think about how do you put them all together, and really be, yeah.
Sorry, just to jump in here. This is one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the course that you guys are both teaching in, because, and maybe this is off, but in my mind, the two things go together really well. So on the one hand, if you have a good understanding of your nervous system and polyvagal theory, that gives you a really good grounding for, regulating your nervous system and expanding that window of tolerance. And then once you have that in place, then you can go in and do the deep trauma work or do the developmental work with the IFS, So they seem to really work really well for treating both trauma and addiction at the same time,
Absolutely. And that is what we're doing. And one of the reasons I was so interested in connecting with you, Cece, is because in the courses that I'm teaching in the Polyvagal Institute, lots of the students are trained in IFS. And they're curious to find out more about how to work with it through the vagus, right? And also through felt sense. So, you know, Gendlin's work with focusing also takes this whole process in a very deep embodied way, and the wisdom that comes from his work for decades, right? And so yeah, I just think it's so complementary. And we talk about parts in focusing too. We talk a lot about the critic and welcoming the critic and befriending the critic.
Exactly, befriending, yes.
Yeah, because the critic is just trying to help us survive, right?
Exactly, of course. If I beat myself up first and make myself perfect, then no one can hurt me.
Yeah, and protecting those little wounded parts, the exiles. Critics are really good at that, right?
Yep, you got it. And I really appreciate this sort of two worlds, you know. Um, I attended a conference years ago, and I don't know who said it, to credit them. They said, you know, the distrust between the traditional psychotherapy community and the traditional, if you want to say, recovery movement, is there's a certain level of distrust. And the psychotherapy community looks across the aisle at, you know, addiction treatment and says, you guys are all about the behavior and just get sober. And there's more to it than that. What about everyone's emotions? And then the addiction community looks across at the aisle at the psychotherapy community and says, you can talk about emotions all day, but maybe you should ask that guy how much he's drinking at night.
Yeah.
Might be an important question to their functioning, right? You know, and so there's, you know, like you won't, like, it's almost like psychotherapists are afraid to ask about behaviors, like they're going to be, you know, offend them or embarrass someone. But so, and there's some truth, obviously, to both sides, you know, too behavior focused or too emotion focused and ignoring sort of obvious behaviors, and not knowing what to do with those behaviors or not knowing what to do with those emotions, right? So I feel like models like this, I've been saying this, and I'll include you in this, Jan, you know, we are a bridge between these two worlds.
Yes.
Bridge. And there's a difference, you know, you go to a community mental health center and the psychotherapist, addiction, you know, trauma and anxiety and depression go in this door, and then the addiction center is over here. And most treatment centers, beautiful, wonderful treatment centers, have the eating disorders clinic, the drinking clinic, the substance clinic, the, you know, sexual behaviors clinic. And I get that. I get that. 20-year-old girl who's been restricting and 50-year-old guy who's been drinking his head off. I get that they have very different stories. So I get that. And yet at the same time, I'm looking as a psychotherapist sitting in my office across from someone suffering. I want to, because that person drinks, and when they're not bulimic, they drink more. And when they're more bulimic, they drink less. And then they do that hooking up thing going on. So what, do we have one thing? Do we have just the one thing? Nobody has the one thing.
No.
Help psychotherapists in outpatient clinics where we first find people. I mean, I'm all for treatment centers and so forth. Many people need more care at a certain point in their work, but how can we have a better conversation that includes the trauma, includes the vulnerability, it includes the behaviors, and it includes a sort of compassionate view of empowering the person. When someone knows how to help themselves get interventional vehicle, then that's empowering. When someone knows how to unblend and get into self-energy, it's empowering.
Yeah, very empowering. And when you understand that these ways that are hurting you are also adaptive when you don't feel safe, that's a huge reframe.
That's right. That's right. These parts are trying to help you. They're just stuck. They've been trying to help you for a long time. Start realizing your critics started that stuff when you were really little. And, you know, like the clients who started, you know, getting into fights on the playground or gambling with their uncles or trying to save pennies for their mom or going on a diet at 5 or stealing the neighbor's beers at 10. So I invite people I always say, when did you first get in trouble? You know, eating disorders. When did you first go on a diet or decide that your body, there was something wrong with it? And you see these little tiny parts trying to in an environment where they didn't have enough. Yeah,
Or, you know, really early stuff like, you know, when you're too little to be able to go buy something or to, you know, to hang out with friends, it's things like going to the fridge or masturbating. These things are very common. And again, you know, a whole area of sex addiction. It's a huge area that we need so much to help young therapists in particular to develop the skill to be able to talk about sex and talk about sex addiction, because it's like it's a serious epidemic, right? Porn addiction. Oh my God.
Now that it's on the phone.
Oh yeah. So we've got a lot of work to do. But can you see, Niall, why Cece and I really enjoy when we started
Sorry,
talking?
did you
Oh
want to
my
speak? Did you want to speak now? Please.
I didn't. I honestly wasn't sure if I was going to get a word in this conversation, but
We'll do our best.
all right. Let's try and make this real for people. Okay, so let's imagine a scenario where I come to you and let's say both of you guys, maybe you're working as a team, and I'm saying, okay, I have a major gambling problem and it's destroying my life. I'm burning all my money. Um, I'm not sure how it started or whatever. How would you go about helping me in that situation, using these two different approaches? So, does anybody want to jump in first here, like how you would approach that situation?
To start, and then I'll see where we go with the body.
All right, sure. Well, first I would just, thank you for telling me. Thank you for trusting me. Have you ever tried to work on this before? Because I want to know what they're holding around this. And then in terms of this, I would, in first session, so I would say, so let me just tell you, Niall, I would see that part of you that's been involved in gambling is in some kind of way trying to help. No, it's not trying to help me. It's ruining my life. It is ruining your life. Those are the consequences. But there's a way that we can work now where we can also get to know the positive intentions of this part. It's more complex than it looks. And when we get to know it in a little different way, we'll be able to work with it. And also, does it make sense to you now that possibly there's some emotional stuff going on in your life? Some tenderness, some challenges? You say, well, yeah, this, that, girlfriend broke up with me, not enough money, this, that. Say, right. So in our work, what we can also do is the things that have not been working well or feeling right emotionally would also be a way that we would know that it connects to the gambling, so we can work with these different parts of you, as well as tell me what is working in your life. Well, I've got a job, I'm making my car payments, I got an apartment, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all the ways in which you're also functioning. So we're going to engage all these parts of you together to sort of create a new way of looking at this thing that will give you a little bit more sense of control and obviously some peace. So those are the kinds of things, I'm shortening it, that I would say in terms of reframing it in the first session, and just start just thinking about it. And the parts of you that are trying to change. And what I also say is, so there's parts of you that brought you to therapy that say, I have to change this thing, it's gone too far. And there are parts of you committed to doing it that you can't change, right? So I'm going to say, Niall, we're going to welcome both sides of you, because both sides of you are trying to adapt in a certain kind of way. They're just at war. And what would it feel like to say, I'm never going to get rid of my parts that try to want me to have a good life, but I'm not also going to get rid of the intention of these parts that got involved in this process, because there's something they're trying to do, and we're going to learn about that. So something around that is how I will begin.
Oh, that's really naming the polarization.
Yeah, I would because
I do that too.
right, because this is how someone lives, is in that inner conflict.
Yeah. And so this is really cool. I do this too, in terms of parts, but also in terms of just teaching about how nervous systems work and how these things that you're doing, gambling, and then I'll say, like, usually people have lots more than just one, because addicts are creative.
Have a drink while you gamble, Niall, right?
That's joke about it sometimes to lighten it a little
right.
bit. And then to begin to do a little bit of psycho ed around, well, this is how bodies work, and starting to go into teaching something about how addictions are like these state regulation strategies. So this really begins to help to articulate the polarization. And as we're saying, the same way that we're teaching clients to unblend, we're unblending from it then too, right? We're saying, we're over here, we see the polarization, we're not getting into it, and we're going to show you how not to get into it or how to get out of it.
Such a good point, Jan. which is that as a therapist now, we're not going to be like, well, have you tried this?
Right.
What would you turn off your phone at night? Have you tried turning off your phone? You know, how far is the gambling parlor for? You know, we don't get into problem solving and directive kinds of behavior, or getting into hopelessness, or, you know, joining into, or just saying, oh, good, well, it's a really good thing you're coming in now. It sounds like it's getting bad. You know, not joining with the sides of you that are feeling urgent. That in Jan's world, whatever that does to my nervous system and yours, if I'm going to now be urgent with you. Oh, well, that's bad. Oh, geez, you lost your house? Wow. Okay. Whoa. You know, so if I get anxious around that, how is that going to help you? I don't know how you put it, Jan. I would say the therapist's energy is 50% of the energy in the room, Zoom room or otherwise. And what are we putting into it? So I love that you're adding that piece.
Yeah, we would talk about that in terms of co-regulation, right? The more that we stay in a ventral state and we stay out of the polarization, partly by naming it,
Yes.
the more we're in this ventral state that bodies will soak up. Bodies will soak that up, and they would, because we feel into each other's nervous system. And the more that people are in our presence, we know that, right? When we're with people that have nice grounded ventral presence, it feels good.
Right. And it feels so different than someone who's anxious,
Yeah, and sympathetic. Yeah.
worried, or someone who's gone dorsal. You know, they're just filled with sort of hopelessness, like, I don't know what to do here. And
But I think this is so important, this piece around polarization, because I really think that it's why therapists don't want to work with addiction. Because they get caught in it and then they feel helpless, like the parts of the person. They collude with those parts. And the more we can help people, right, to really see that and not fall into it. It's like falling into depression with your client. You both end up in a dorsal state, like, oh, you know, God. Yeah.
Right, right. So many times when I'm talking to someone and they're talking about a case, I'll say, as you talk about this person, and I'm talking about a therapist, what comes up for you? What is it like for you? What are you noticing? You might say, what's happening in your nervous system as you speak about this case?
Or your body, what's happening in your
What's
body, in
happening in
your
your
gut.
body as you speak about
Yeah.
this. Exactly. So we're also so much of connecting around helping someone is connecting to how we're being impacted. Because it's normal to be impacted. Go ahead, Niall. Yeah.
Can I just ask? I thought what you said there, Jan, super interesting. That, and you said it earlier as well, Cece, that one of the main reasons that therapists do not like to work with addiction is because they get pulled into that polarization cycle, and then maybe they identify as the managers in that
Pleasure.
system, and
Yeah,
that's
then they feel really bad about themselves because they're not having success.
you can't
Because
win that.
they fed into the power struggle, the internal power struggle. They fed into it and merged with it. And I really believe that that's basically why a lot of trauma therapists don't want to work with addiction. And we don't really have great models. We don't have a variety. We have a 12-step model, which helps some people enormously. But what else do we have? This is why we're trying to really bring this in through IFS and through FSPM. And to, you know, so for us, I use what we call the 4-circle practice. I don't know if you're familiar. You mentioned Patrick Cairns. While he does have, it's a more traditional model, I like some of his work a lot. And he has this 3-circle practice that he talks about.
Yes, I'm familiar.
We brought it in, made it 4 circles, and I've integrated the nervous system and felt sensing into that. But it's the basic idea that you're working with a client to develop a map, which again, it's a way of not buying into polarization by just helping them to see, okay, what's in that inner circle that you're ready to harm reduce, right? Because we use harm reduction. I'm sure you do too, right? It takes side, sobriety can be part of it, but for lots of people that doesn't work, you know, and it doesn't fit. So you check in with the body. What would your body feel ready to begin to manage and contain a little bit more? We put those behaviors in that inner circle. The second circle are the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, and the dorsal branch of triggered states. Like, what is it that activates you, that gets you into those behaviors? Let's name what they are in your life. The third circle is the ventral branch, or what Patrick Cairns would call the, the safe behaviors, the good life. And so you help people build that over time. Things like phoning a friend, or engaging in a focusing partnership, or going and seeing your IFS therapist, or, journaling, or whatever those things are. And then the fourth circle we added as a deeper spiritual kind of practice, in a lot of indigenous cultures and other cultures that really move out into the natural world and into some kind of ritual, dance practice, chanting, humming, these kinds of things. So, and then you've got a map, and it's not a map that says, you have to do these things. It's not written by the managers. It's created through self, in collaboration with us, the therapist.
It's quite beautiful. And I really appreciate, your underscoring, Niall, about what happens to therapists when they hear they're going to have, when they even working with someone for some amount of time, and then they found out their client is smoking cannabis every night, or then they find out that their client is, going to massage parlors. Then they find out. So even people who have established solid relationships with clients will then sort of feel like they've been kind of taught, well, you need to go to a SA, or, you need to go to Gamblers Anonymous. You need to, and often sort of feel that they're supposed to abandon the client, or I need to refer you to a specialist in this.
Oh God, yeah.
And even so clients finally have a trust in sort of revealing this, but the therapist has anxiety. And I think also feels like we've been told in some kind of way that we're not equipped, that the real people that are supposed to help them are the people who are in recovery, that they're the ones who really know the score.
Yeah,
that's who our client's going to relate to, and that's who can really do that. And I think that thinking is very embedded and encouraged, and it comes from a place where there was nothing else. In 1930s, when Bill W. developed, there was not really, people didn't have psychotherapy to go to. So it's truly a very more modern invention, if you will, and the availability is still too limited for a lot of people. But I think for therapists, they also carry that belief, like, am I supposed to? Is it okay?
exactly, yeah.
What you're also saying is the fear, like, I won't know what to do, or they try and they don't feel like they have a plan. So we sort of have a map of the system, that helps the therapist separate from the client's system to help them with it. And ways that, so what we're both talking about, I think, is giving therapists hope and therapists a plan, so that they don't feel they have to just turn over their expertise. There's so much here's therapists who are saying calmly, oh yes, I work with complex trauma all the time, but my client starts, throwing up their food, and it's like, I got to refer them to an eating disorder expert, someone they've known really, really well. So
yeah, terrible.
we're on the same page here, Jan. It's just giving therapists some tools and a sense of confidence and a sense of a map and a paradigm shift.
A new paradigm.
How to think about and to soften the differences between anxiety and depression and addiction, but soften these distinctions and just think, you hear someone's an addict, and then the therapist, I've had therapists say to me, oh yeah, well, they're not going to tell me the truth.
Oh, I know. It's such contempt.
Which, would they say that to their client with depression?
No.
With anxiety. So there's also a way in which, and I don't blame that therapist, it's in our culture, it's bigger than the psychotherapy world, the larger culture that we all are operating under, the patriarchal culture.
I remember we talked about this too, in terms of, I think it's that real hyper masculine culture where addiction is like the worst because it's a state of dependency, right? And that is so violating for this sense of like hyper masculinity and empowerment that men are supposed to really embody. And it's so destructive for men and women, because then, of course, women, we're seen in through a misogynistic lens as the dependent ones. So then guys that are addicts are like they merge into and take on this dependent kind of identity, and it's super shaming for men. Terrible, terrible, terrible.
So I love that we're looking at the sort of the big picture way in which individual clients and individual therapists, we are all sort of under this umbrella and needed some new ways. So it's beautiful to have this time to talk to you, Jan, and to have you invite us, Niall.
Yeah,
Paint a new picture with you.
yeah, we're getting into it. Yeah.
Well, it's been such a pleasure, guys. It's been 100 mile an hour the whole time, but I've enjoyed every minute of it. And I've actually got some new insights here that have totally knocked me for six. So thanks very much. Both of you will be teaching on our upcoming holistic recovery course, which is going to be launched quite soon after this conversation. This is basically sort of like a multidisciplinary approach to understanding, assessing, and treating addiction. You know, we've got harm reduction in there. We've got Mark Lewis's learning model. We've got IFS with Cece. We've got polyvagal theory with Jan. And we've got some social interventions and some existential work as well. So we're sort of taking like the biggest possible picture we can of addiction, and we're making it as affordable as we possibly can for as many people to learn this as possible. You know, so I think you guys were saying earlier that, you know, it's so widespread now, and it might not appear in the first session, but after a few sessions, most people come to therapy, there's going to be some kind of addiction present, you know. So that's kind of what we're up to, and I want to say a huge thank you for you both for contributing to the course, but also for this amazing discussion today. So where can people find you both online after this? Where would you recommend people to go to learn more about your work, your books, and anything else?
For me, janwinhall.com. Just go to my website or the Polyvagal Institute. I have a training course there as well, polyvagal.org. Yeah.
Same with me. You can go to my website, C Sykes LCSW, and you can also go to the Internal Family Systems Institute website to learn more about IFS. And I also have some courses there that you can sign up for. And there's workshops, and we've got our podcasts out there, thanks to you, Niall, and others, right? So they're all on our websites, and our book. And Jan, you've got a new book coming out. So
I do, yeah, next March that you're in. Right at the end, I got Cece in there.
we're integrating. We're working on this integrating. We're
That's
working on it.
right. Yeah.
Live. It's live.
And also we did an embodied dialogue series that I do. It's on YouTube. Cece and I did a couple of months ago, I guess. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
I just want to point people to your books as well, because people will be interested in reading them after this conversation. So Jan's, yours is Treating Trauma and Addiction with a Felt Sense Polyvagal Model.
Mhm.
And Cease, yours is Internal Family Systems for Addictive Processes. Is that the title of yours as well?
Internal Family System for Addiction. The publisher said addiction cease, but then it is compassion-based, trauma-informed interventions for substance eating, food.
The world of publishing.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks so much, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure, and
Thanks,
enjoy the rest
Niall.
of your weeks.
Thank you so much, Niall.
Great to see you again. Bye, Niall.